dancer choreographer Padma Menon draws on her Indian cultural heritage as well as Western dance practice. She joins me today to talk about her moving archetype dance classes. Welcome, Padma.
Thank you, Barbie. Lovely to be here.
Padma, what is an archetype?
There's been lots of definitions of archetypes, both in the West and in the East. But the way that I think of archetypes is that they are characters or stories from legends, myths, cultures, which are symbolic of bigger things. So they symbolize some kind of cultural, cultural commonality, and they are important to those cultures. It's a kind of cultural consciousness, and that's what they represent. So, for example, archetypes like Achilles from the Greek epic Iliad, or Shiva, which is an archetype from India. You could also have literary archetypes like some of the Shakespearean characters, which I've worked with, like Ophelia or Macbeth. And you can see that they all represent a certain larger kind of stories or characters or beings. And they've been studied or described or worked with both in the West and in the East. So in the West, you've had people like Carl Jung, who first gave a lot of importance to archetypes, and then people, some of the psychologists who came after him, like James Hillman and others, developed on the theory of archetypes. But in some of the Eastern traditions, archetypes have been around for a long time, for centuries. So if I take the example of India, most of Indian theatre is actually based on the embodying of archetypes. And they have really well-structured, rigorous, sophisticated frameworks of how you approach the archetypes, what is your relationship to the archetypes, how do you kind of embody the physicality, and even what is the relationship of somebody who is watching you perform those archetypes, and that the person who's watching is never passive. So there is a real intentionality about that relationship. How do you actually develop that particular relationship between your doing, what is the purpose of you performing these archetypes? So it's not just to entertain, but you're trying to create a transformative process in people who are participating in watching you do that. So there's a real richness in some of these Eastern traditions. And what I really love about that is that it's not that you're kind of playing with things, because I think James Hillman says that sometimes when you work with archetypes, you can be in a bit of a fantasy land and think that, you're Cleopatra or whatever, and I'm not sure how useful that is. Whereas some of these more rigorous and structured traditions really give you a very purposeful and meaningful way of approaching them, and are kind of much more rigorous. I mean, I keep using the word rigorous because there's so much of archetypal work that is a little bit, fun, which is fine. But here there's a definite purpose and meaning about why you would approach the archetypes.
Can you describe the experiences of your students from these particular classes?
So in the dance classes, I really draw on philosophy, on culture, and on dance. So dance, it's not actually an arts for art's sake. When in my younger days, I was a fierce believer in arts for art's sake. But as you grow older, you kind of want much more purpose and meaning in what you're doing. So the dance really is a way, a means to an end. What I do in the classes is take these archetypes from different cultures and look at what do they mean. Why are they physical in this way? So we go back to the sculptures as far back as I can go, as close to the source as I can, and that becomes the starting point for the physicality. And because I think there is a certain authenticity of, some, especially in traditions like Indian, where sculpture, dance, music, all of them came from that same source philosophy, as it was in the Greek tradition as well. And so, if you link into the painting, the sculpture, and the dance, you get a certain kind of, more of an authenticity, whatever that word means, of physicalizing these archetypes. So we then really, the first step is to not be intellectual, get out of your head, and just approach them very purely through their physicality. And it's like you enter this world, you enter this being of this archetype. But at the same time, what I draw from Western psychology, especially from James Hillman, is that you are always in a relationship with the archetype. Unless you come from some of the traditions, like the Indian tradition, where your life is devoted to actually almost embodying and becoming the archetype. Now, that's a very different, a long process. And often in those Indian traditions, one person will specialize in one archetype. And that's what they do for their whole life, is they embody, they perform as that archetype, they embody, almost live as that archetype. But we don't live in those times now. So I'm very mindful of that Western tradition as well, that you are in a relationship with the archetype, so you bring yourself into it. So there is that self-reflective interaction as well when I'm teaching a class. So when we do the movement, it's okay, so where are you at with the movement? What is it? How do you then go back to yourself? And so we have a bit of guided improvisation. How do you go back to yourself? Where does this archetype sit in you? So there's a realistic sort of relationship there, rather than, like what Hillman says about the fantasy of, becoming someone, which is not terribly useful.
Which particular archetypes have you chosen for your classes, Padma?
It's funny because sometimes archetypes choose you rather than you choosing them. And a lot of the time in my life, especially when I used to work professionally and kind of perform or actually choreograph these archetypes for other people, they just kind of appear. So when I was in a very difficult time in my life personally, Kali appeared, and a lot of my work kind of what drew on that archetype of Kali. The kind of the stepping into the unknown, the anger, fury, etc. And then sometimes when dancers used to come to me, I did a work with a French ballerina, and we worked on Ophelia, and turns out that was quite meaningful to things that were happening in her life. And then I did another work in India, several works for dancers, and they'd bring the archetypes, and somehow they were meaningful to them in whatever they were exploring in their own life narratives. So the archetypes that came to me for the ones that I chose here, one was Kali. And I think I chose Kali because, for me, she's an archetype of our time. And that's because, Kali has been misunderstood or appropriated for various causes. And, that all of that is fine, I suppose, if it's useful. But the original philosophy of Kali, which comes a lot from the tantric philosophy in India, is the unknown. She is the unknown. She represents stepping into the unknown, but also how do you stay with that? How are you okay with being in the unknown? And what does the unknown give you in terms of a transformative, fertile, creative space? And at the same time, while you're in the unknown, there are also known things. And this is the complexity of all these archetypes, is that they don't just represent the one thing. It's like how life is a mosaic. So at the same time, Kali is also maternal. There is a nurturing quality. There's a beauty of the unknown. So there's all of this thing in which coexist. And that's what many of these archetypes remind us, is that we don't have to be overwhelmed by the one thing, because at the same time in life, there are many things that coexist. And I think somehow in life, we want things to be very simple and linear. And then if you look at the big discourses of our times, like economics or science, it's all kind of about simplifying, making things linear and explain things and understand things. But there's also a real sense in life of mystery and, just being with complexity, where things are not polarized or binary, but they all kind of sometimes coexist in ways that might seem totally contradictory to us. But that is life. And I think for me, Kali really represents that sense of complexity and of the beauty of the unknown. So that was the archetype we did, and she is a challenging archetype, but gives you a lot if you kind of, surrender to that power. The other thing we did was Green Tara, which was an archetype I'm less familiar with, but seemed like people wanted Green Tara. But when I started working with Green Tara and teaching Green Tara, it was probably the most popular course. And she had a sense of playfulness, which took me back to my early 20s. where life is a kind of a bit of a play, and there's this joyful compassion and active compassion. So compassion isn't about just passivity and sitting, but there's a certain kind of dynamism about Green Tara's compassion. And yet at the same time there's a power, because sometimes we think if you're playful and feminine and graceful and beautiful that you're not powerful. But you know, there's a real sense of power. So there was this absolutely beautiful space that Green Tara brought in with the archetype. And now I'm doing warriors, again, you know, but looking at, you know, we think of the warrior or the hero narrative as the one thing, it's universal. But if you look at the warriors we're doing is Achilles, Arjuna, and Durga. And so they are three very, very, very different warriors, all with their own nuances of how to be a warrior as well. And then I'll be looking at Shiva this year, which is my favorite archetype, the ascetic dancer.
This approach to dance teaching is very different from a normal Western approach where people might come in, learn some dance steps, do a jazz routine. Can you take us through how you work, what you do with the student?
So for me, dance is the means to an end. And I choose dance because it's a symbolic language, well, in some traditions, the tradition that I use, and therefore it matches the symbolic nature of the archetypes. So there's this absolute beautiful match. I don't expect when people come in that they are dancers or they know anything about dance. In fact, I think sometimes when you're dancers, you get you sometimes lose the power of dance as a language because it gets so automatic. So a lot of people that come in are not dancers. And the idea is that the space is safe. It's an invitation for people to step in, to stop judging themselves, and to give themselves permission to experience being in a place where it's a place of discovery, of mystery. And since these archetypes are really powerful, so you're not actually in a space of vulnerability, even when you're exploring particular states of being or emotions or whatever it is. It's very structured. And that kind of keeps it a safe space. And also because these archetypes are so powerful, you're actually looking at these things in a very empowered framework. So it's like, it's an invitation to a bit of an adventure. And I think we have so few spaces in the world where, you know, we're not thinking about achieving things and doing things and, you know, learning something and kind of, you know, coming out with some product. So this is a space where it's almost like you can have things that you can explore and use it as a kind of meditation for yourself, if that's what you wish. But more importantly, it's giving yourself permission to be in a space of mystery and discovery without pre-setting or preempting what you're going to get from it.
Padma, you've been working for a long time now with the archetypal model, the framework, both in your earlier dance training and more recently in Canberra. Where's it taking you? Where are you taking it? What do you want from it?
So when I started with this archetypes work, it came into my life, you know, quite by accident, because I started working first with other dancers, you know, when they brought in things that they wanted to work with. And then I found that the reason I was drawn to it was because it was really the dance tradition that I did was about these archetypes. And there was a huge, there was this really rich and structured way of approaching archetypes, which was powerful, which was transformative, and that's why it was being done. And I remember studying from Peggy Hackney, who was one of the world specialists in Laban Movement, and she told me that, you know, the dance that I was studying and doing from India is actually made to do this kind of work. And that made me think that I need to share this. You know, there's a belief in India that if you have been lucky enough to have inherited knowledge, because, you know, we all inherit knowledge, and I certainly inherited this knowledge from my teacher, who was 11th generation performer in this tradition. And I feel like, so they say that if you don't actually pass it on, you'll be wandering around as, restless spirits. So I definitely don't want to do that. And so for me, there was this thing that I wanted to share this, and I wanted to pass this on. And I felt there was value in this because we live in times where so much is individual-centered. So much of it is about focusing on each person as an individual. Even in the psychology counseling tradition, so much of it is about, what is your individual experience? What is your suffering as an individual? And I experience that very much, and a lot of people I teach, as very isolating. We can't find, it's almost like you can't find meaning for your life as an individual experience, that it becomes meaningful when it's connected to what's going on around, what are the bigger narratives? What are the larger stories? And these stories are as real as anything else, that, anything else in science, or, the stories we create in science, or in economics, or the narratives we create about, about how life is. And so are these archetypes. They're very, very meaningful. They're like the narratives of our social psyche. And so for me, it was really important to kind of place these in the world as well, or kind of replace them actually, because they're already there. And the other thing is we buy into these archetypes anyway. We buy into the archetypal narratives. And I think it's important that we're aware of it, so that we're not kind of being somehow used by these narratives in ways that we're unconscious about. And then when we become conscious of it, we can also change our own stories. And definitely the big thing for me is feeling connected to the bigger world and the bigger stories. And I feel like we live in times where that connectedness becomes really more and more important, and almost the only way to go forward in the times that we live in.
This mirrors very much the Indigenous Australian experience that we have, where wisdom is passed down from the elders are respected, and there's a lot of non-verbal transmission of knowledge through dance, through art. It's a language without words, isn't it?
Absolutely, because that knowledge is embodied. It's embodied in the nature, in the land, in the people, in the stories, and the only way you can approach it is not through the head, but just through the heart, through the body, through being in it. And I think that's the way for us. For me, increasingly, that's going to be the most important way that we can actually find a new way of being in our new reality, because we're really in a new reality now with our planet, with what's going on. And I think this offers a way of being in that new reality.
Padma Menon, thank you.